tonight, or this morning, you'll notice that we're kind of focusing on the cross. Go ahead and sit down. I'm sorry. Go ahead and sit down. As we focus on that, our study in the Gospel of John is going through the crucifixion of Jesus, and it's important for us to focus on that because for John, it was the moment in which Jesus was on the cross that he was glorified. He fulfilled all that he had come and all that he did, and so it's important for us to see that from John's perspective. Now, I'm interested. I'm taking a little poll this morning. How many of you can't wait for the election to be over? Holy cow, almost unanimous. I know that feeling. I am getting so tired of the phone calls that all come around 6 o'clock in the afternoon, right as I'm ready to put that spoon of soup or whatever we're eating, spaghetti, in my mouth. How many are just tired of the pollsters calling and asking? You know, it's really interesting. They're calling from all over the world. They're interested in what I have to say. I just can't believe that somebody's interested in anything that I have to say. But it's incredible how many phone calls we get every night. Every night we're getting telephone calls, all wanting to know who we're voting for, what we're supporting, or what we're going to be doing when election day comes. Well, there was a woman who, in a sense, there was a medical billing company that had just launched an 800 number. They were really proud that they were launching this 800 number so that their clients and their customers could call without any cost to ask questions about their hospital bills. And so they were pleased. They launched it. The only thing was that this poor woman, it was the same phone number as hers. It was 800, and then it was her phone number. And so as soon as they launched that, she was getting all these telephone calls wanting to know about their medical bills over and over again. So finally she got so frustrated, she finally called the company and said, "Do you realize what you just did? Your 800 number is really the same number as mine." And they said, "Well, that's just too bad. You're just going to have to change your number." And she said, "Wait a minute. This is the same number that I've had for 35 years. Everybody knows this number. My kids memorize this number. I'm not going to change my number." "Well, it's too bad. You're just going to have to change your number." "Well, fine," she says. "Fine. I'll tell you what. The next time somebody calls me and asks me about their medical bill, I'm going to tell them that it's paid in full." So the medical billing thing got a new number the next day. Paid in full. In our study this week, as we were gathered on Wednesday, we were discussing about Jesus' last words on the cross. And Shauna Brim brought up that in one of Bruce Urson's, the former pastor here, had preached a service that those last words, "I thirst," telekinesis, you should probably remember that, don't you? I put you on the spot, Matt. It can be like most Greek words, could be what's the word I want? Could be looked at from different ways. In Adam Hamilton, he believes that it's finished in the sense as if you had completed a marathon and you crossed the finish line and you're so excited and it's celebrated that it is finished. And that's the words that Jesus basically was saying upon the cross. He said, "It is finished, it's done, I've completed," and then he breathed his last and his spirit went with God. But there is also another way of interpreting that word. Paid in full. Paid in full. So the word "it is finished" in Greek could also be translated to be paid in full, like we are paying an account. And you get that rubber stamp that says "paid in full" on your account. And that is what John is wanting to say, that when Christ was hanging upon the cross, when he says it is finished, the sins that he was bearing upon his shoulders, the sins of the world, was paid in full because of his life and his death given on the cross. So this morning, as we focus on the cross, we're going to be remembering that John's gospel is a little different than the other gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. This morning I'm going to read from to chapter 19, where it begins, "And then Pilate handed Jesus over to them to be crucified. So they took Jesus, and carrying the cross by himself, he went out to what is called the place of the skull, which in Hebrew is called Golgotha. There they crucified him. With him 2 others, one on either side, with Jesus between them. Pilate also had an inscription written and put on the cross. It read, 'Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews.' Many of the Jews read this inscription, and because the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and it was written in Hebrew, in Latin, and Greek. Then the chief priests of the Jews said to Pilate, 'Do not write the King of the Jews, but this man said, I am the King of the Jews.' Pilate answered, 'What I have written, I have written.'" This morning you may have noticed that at the beginning of our service, in the call to worship, we had much of recalling that Christ is the King of our lives. Christ is the Lord of Lords and the King of Kings. And that is what John wants us to see. In fact, in this particular chapter of John, the 19th chapter, he uses the word king or kingdom 15 times to demonstrate for us and to try to persuade us to realize that Jesus is truly the King of our lives, the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. When Jesus is before Pilate, and Pilate is confused when he's saying, "They say you are the King of the Jews." And Jesus says, "That is not of my kingdom." His kingdom was one made up of followers, people who believed, who sought to walk in Jesus' path, who sought to allow Jesus to be a part of their lives, who saw Jesus as their king and worshipped and followed him. That is the kingdom that Jesus is talking about. But the Jewish leaders were concerned. They believed that Jesus had come to create this kingdom that would overtake Rome. Pilate was confused. Pilate was uncertain. Pilate saw no reason to kill Jesus other than the Jewish leaders wanting him dead and silenced. And so the process began. How are we going to kill him? How are we going to do this? It was by the cross. The cross was a form of execution that was considered by many across all of history as one of the worst forms of the way to die. In this day and age, we would equivalent with it as being like it would be equivalent to the electric chair, or the gas chamber, the gallows. Horrible ways to die. For the Roman peoples, the only people that were crucified were the criminals, the hardened and bad criminals, and they were put to death as a way to demonstrate that you don't mess with us. The death was long, enduring, and painful, oftentimes being flogged before they died. And they say that one of the reasons that Jesus probably died in 6 hours was the fact that he was nearly bled to death after being flogged before he was hung on the cross. The cross, as you look upon it, the cross in which, like I wear, the cross that we have in our church, is really an instrument of death. A horrible instrument of painful and awful death in which one would endure. And yet for us, it has become a symbol of what it is to be a Christian. You see a cross and you know that it's a Christian, a person that is wearing a cross, a building that has a cross. You know that it's a church or a Christian who is wearing the cross. But imagine today, if Jesus were here today, they would probably use an electric chair or gallows, and we may be using a different symbol than the cross. What I find interesting in this day and age is there are churches now being built that there is not a single cross in sight. There are modern day churches now that are being built that there is no cross anywhere in the structure or outside that you would know that it was a Christian place. Why? Because people don't want to look at the suffering side of that. Paul Osteen, the pastor in Houston, Texas, has been quoted as saying, if a preacher wants to preach about the cross, and if the church wants to focus itself on the cross, that church will never grow, because people want to focus on success rather than sacrifice. They want to focus on success rather than sacrifice. And so what we have now are people that are concerned about what that might appear like if we start talking about the sacrifice that Christ made for us. In the whole time of John's gospel, it is in that moment of the crucifixion that Jesus is glorified. It is in that moment that he's carrying all of the sins of the world upon his shoulders. It is in that moment he is demonstrating God's love for us, and it is that moment that love becomes real, to the point that he is willing to die for us. So the cross becomes an important symbol for us to remember his sacrifice for us. And out of his sacrifice, not only we have forgiveness, we have the promise and the hope of life eternal. That gift is a gift that we have because of the cross. Senator John McCain wrote in his autobiography about his life as a POW, a prisoner of war during the Vietnam War. And I don't care what people say, but I believe that this man is a hero in what he has done for our nation, but also serving in the Senate. But while he was in the prisoner of war camp, there was a night in which he was tied up around a post by his hands and his feet and beaten severely, almost to the point of death. In fact, as he said, he'd rather die than to continue to live because it was so painful. After he was beaten, the soldiers, the guards, left the room, and there came a man that he'd never seen before, but came and very gently took the ropes from Senator McCain's hands and his feet so that he was no longer bound to the pole, allowed to lie down on the ground to recover from his wounds, to collect his thoughts, and try to heal from what he just endured. He never saw that man again until Christmas Day, months later, when all of the soldiers who were in the POW camp were brought outside in the midst of the cold, standing outside at attention for hours at a time on Christmas Day as a way of punishing them. When he saw this man who had unbound him and helped him in his time after his punishment, and the man came and he stood beside him, he looked at him, and then with his shoe, he made the sign of a cross in the dirt. Senator McCain looked at the cross and looked at the man. And Senator McCain says, "This was the best Christmas present I ever received." The man wiped out the cross and just slowly walked away. But in viewing that cross, he realized what the Savior had endured for him. That the Savior, in a sense, endured all that he did on the cross so that he might be able to live through this. And in knowing that, it was in his suffering that he knew that he too could have the strength to endure the suffering. But in the gift of reminding himself that Jesus had died and rose again, gave him the hope to continue in that POW camp. The cross for us is truly a symbol of love. We look upon it in our sanctuary. We have it on our steeple. It's a sign of hope and love for the world. 2,000 years ago was a horrible instrument of death. When you're in the Holy Land, and you're standing where supposedly Calvary is, where the crosses were on the day that Jesus died, you're only about 7 miles from Bethlehem. A couple of hours and you could walk there. You would be there in less time than Jesus hung on the cross. But there began 30 years, a lifetime, of a babe born in a manger, because God so loved the world that he sent his only begotten Son. That in those 30 years was a lifetime of journey that led to the cross, where once again God demonstrated to the world his great love for us, for all, for you and for me, that he would allow his Son to be sacrificed so that we might live, so that we might experience that great love ourselves. Let us pray. Gracious and holy God, we thank you that in the life and death and resurrection of Jesus, we are reminded of your great power, the power of death, of love over death. As we look upon the cross, may we be reminded of that great love. Amen.